Hey there. This episode was recorded in early February, so if you're wondering why we're talking about politics but the coronavirus situation isn't coming up, well, that's the reason why. Enjoy the show. You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast, produced in collaboration with the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. This week we're talking about politics and polarization. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we bring on a rotating panel of our science contributors to pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
Hi, I'm Joshua Conrad Jackson, and I'm a PhD student in the psychology department at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I study how culture changes over time and the impact of changing culture on human psychology.
And my name's Julia Torbett-Jones. I'm a lecturer at the Wellington School of Business and Government here in New Zealand at the Victoria University of Wellington, and I study economics, environment, and institutions.
And my name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I'm a web developer and web designer, and I work on the Useful Science website. So Josh, let's dive into your article.
Thanks, Cameron. I feel like the politics angle is kind of unique for Useful Science, but it seems fitting because as we're recording this episode, people are beginning to caucus in Iowa for the eventual Democratic presidential nominee. And for me, today is unique in another way because I'm actually speaking about some research that I have done rather than research that other folks have done. The title of the paper I'll be summarizing is Ecological and Cultural Factors Underlying the Global Distribution of Prejudice, and it is actually the largest collaborative project I've worked on. We had 19 authors from across South America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania, and we end up surveying over 2 million people across the 7 studies in this paper. So I'm going to give a more high-level overview of what we found.
Are these 7 studies that you conducted, or is this like a meta-analysis?
These are 7 studies we conducted, but some of these studies were using archival data. Okay, and wow. So not all of them involved recruiting people to do surveys or experiments.
And just a general question out of interest. So when you've got such a big team, how do you pull them together?
Well, I think we began pulling them together because we wanted to do a big cross-cultural field study as part of this research program. And the field study turned out to be more of a minor element in the research because it was exploring questions that weren't as fundamental to the analyses we ended up doing. But it started off just being because we wanted them to help us recruit people from around the world, and it ended up being because they were really insightful about dynamics that were specific to the countries they were coming from.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting team to work with, and lots of really good feedback on the eventual paper. We started the research because it was in the midst of a really rapid rise in right-wing governments, right-wing nationalist governments, and a lot of these right-wing nationalist governments were also right-wing populist governments in Europe and North America. Now, when I'm speaking about right-wing populism, I'm speaking about political parties which combine an anti-liberal sentiment with a nationalist and nativist message. So these are governments that want to limit immigration, foreign aid, and globalization while claiming that they're speaking to the common people. So the term that the Trump administration uses is the silent majority. Now, I'm not necessarily going to discuss whether these governments are good or bad for a country, but I'll speak instead about why they might be rising. And before we even started our research, we noticed that right-wing governments were not the only rising global trend. Over the last 20 years, our planet has also been warming, and this global warming has co-occurred with a surge of natural disasters. Forest fires, floods, and hurricanes are all rising in their frequency and severity. 8 out of the last 10 years have been the warmest on record, and marine biologists have warned that many coral reefs could disappear entirely by 2040. Now, these trends are rarely discussed together, and when they are, they're typically seen as an unfortunate coincidence, since many right-wing populist governments often obstruct climate change policy. But we wondered if these trends could actually be related, and our hypothesis was that climate shocks make people in society feel threatened, and this feeling of threat leads people to endorse strong leaders who support stability through rule of law and ostracize people who don't conform to norms. And these are the kinds of politicians that often lead right-wing governments. Now, to understand why we developed this hypothesis, I think it's important to step away from current events and to look at how climate has shaped culture throughout history. Now, over time, the most threatened regions of the world have often developed the strictest rules because these rules have been really important for survival. So, for example, in societies with high rates of famine or flooding, children are socialized to eat in moderation, to save for the future. Weddings are more tightly restricted as an economic resource, etc. And we predicted that these rules could eventually feed into a global culture of what we called tightness, where social norms are strictly moderated and regulated, and people who violate these norms are harshly punished. And that
Can I just interrupt for 2 seconds? Can I ask for a definition just out of interest? What do you mean by norms?
Well, norms are really broad. I mean, any social norm, any social convention. So a norm could be, typical dress in a society, or it could be etiquette over dinner, or it could be something that that you don't necessarily think of as a behavioral norm, like what religion you practice. And so there could be norms that are really functional, like we all wait to cross the street, but typically in societies where these norms are really tight, there are also tight norms that aren't necessarily as functional, like this is the religion that everyone follows. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Are you saying that there's a correlation between economic scarcity and societies that have more strict norms like these? Is that what you said?
Well, that was actually one of the major things that we were wondering in our research.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, I'll get to that in just a minute, and by just a minute, I mean right now. The basic hypothesis was that in regions with high societal threat, people would develop this sense of cultural tightness, and then this would lead people to support right-wing nationalist messages of exclusion and of law and order. And so we began the research by surveying cultural tightness in historical societies and in modern-day nations, and testing whether the culturally tightest societies occurred in regions of the world with high levels of environmental threat. And so measuring tightness in historical societies would involve reading ethnographies that anthropologists had compiled in the 18th, 19th century. So these were often either nation states or ethnicities that have since gone extinct, but had societies functioning in that time period, like the Kung Bushmen in southern Africa. And then measuring tightness in contemporary nations just involved surveying many thousands of people in countries around the world and asking how strict they felt that their society was, how much freedom they had to make the decisions they wanted to make, and how much their personal preferences were kind of regulated or outside of their control. And so we looked at 86 historical societies in 25 countries in these first studies, and we found that the places with the most tightness, such as Turkey and Malaysia, were the places that had that were the most afflicted by environmental threats. And we also found that these were the regions with the most negative attitudes towards foreigners. And amongst historical societies like the Fellahin of Egypt or the Kung Bushmen, these were also the societies that had the most authoritarian leaders. So those that had the fewest checks on their power and kind of the most strongman attitudes towards implementing rules. Is that all clear so far?
Yep.
Cool. So in our next studies, we extended this research to the United States, which has a lot of political variation even within a single nation. And so we were testing whether the tightest U.S. states were those that had the highest rates of environmental threat. And we chose to measure tightness in another way in this study by looking at archival records. And so, for example, how frequently children who stepped out of line in schools received corporal punishment, how much criminals were subject to the death sentence by state, and we tested whether this variance was associated with both histories of ecological threats like flooding and environmental shock or hurricanes or earthquakes, and also whether these were the regions that were the most likely to vote for Donald Trump in the most recent election, even holding constant previous patterns of voting for Republicans. And so this is exactly what we found. But when I talk to people about this research, they often bring up California, which I think is where you live, Cameron.
That's right, yeah.
Because this is a region of the country with forest fires, with high earthquake rates, and yet it's one of the most progressive and democratic areas of the nation. And it was a big outlier in our analysis, and I mean, we still don't really know why this was, but one potential factor we think could be the historical rates of diversity in California. Just there have been so many different groups mixing, religions, ethnicities, cultural groups, that maybe this prevented the coalescing of really strong norms, although that's just a guess.
We also probably have the biggest university system in the country, I would guess. If that might be a factor. Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole study there, but that's the big exception in our research program.
But what about just wealth? Like, doesn't wealth closely correlate to this?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
But then within California, I think it's the wealthy areas in the north that are the most conservative. Is that right? Or am I getting
I could
wrong?
imagine that. Yeah. I don't know if that's true, but yeah.
Does it also suggest that maybe there are other factors that could be influencing some of this prejudice?
Yeah, of course. So we're looking at really big societal trends here. And if you look at the figures of this paper, and we'll post it, I assume, with the episode, you'll see that these are relationships that are... you can definitely see a relationship between these variables, but there's noise, because when you're dealing with huge cultural factors, you're going to have so many causes that you're never going to fully explain the phenomenon. We're just trying to statistically explain why regions might be more likely to vote for right-wing versus left-wing politicians. And so this is not a study that's trying to solve why people vote the way they do. It's mostly just identifying one big predictor of this.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so after we did these big cross-cultural studies, we decided to look at the individual people who might feel threatened and the people who might vote for right-wing politicians. And it's an interesting dynamic, because usually when we think of people who are nervous about the environment, we think about, like bleeding heart liberals or progressives. And that's because we use words like climate change when we speak about this. But in these surveys that we did, we actually just asked about how much people were afraid of, running out of resources in their area or storms hitting their area. And what we found in these studies was that people who were the most afraid of these more proximal, like environmental factors that could be happening outside of your door, were those that had the most hostile attitudes towards foreigners. They were the most likely to support more law and order in the country. And what probably the most interesting thing about these studies is that we did them during the election cycles in the US in 2016 and in France in 2017, where Marine Le Pen was running for election, who endorsed a lot of right-wing populist positions. And we found that these people who were the most afraid of environmental threats occurring were those that were the most likely to vote for Le Pen and Trump, even controlling for their wealth and their gender, their age, these other factors that can commonly predict voting preferences.
Josh, when you're talking about environmental threats, I'm sorry if you already answered this, but are we talking about literally environment, like acts of God, earthquakes and things like that, or are we also talking about things like refugee crises?
So we measured both in these studies, and in some of the analyses we combined them into like a summed score, but it isn't very surprising to think of people who are afraid of terrorists voting for Donald Trump. And so in a lot of these analyses we also disaggregated those that didn't involve social dynamics. And so when I speak about the term environmental threat, I'm speaking about the environment more broadly, kind of both your social and your natural environments, but the effects look quite similar when you disaggregate these things into different factors.
And were you able to control for the likelihood that an event would happen in a particular region or state in the US or anything? So, for instance, if you were to ask about an environmental threat in California, people might be much more inclined to, and excluding the outlier discussion that you were having before, but people might be able to visualize it and imagine it actually happening. Whereas in other regions, maybe it's a distant threat. Were you able to control for that sort of stuff?
Yeah, we didn't control for that, but it raises a really interesting point that we're trying to explore in the future, which is the difference between when people actually experience these threats and when they think about experiencing them.
So real and perceived threats, sort of thing.
Yeah, and so what we often find is that, responding to Cameron's question, I mentioned that you can disaggregate the sort of social threats that people face, like attacks from a foreign nation, and the more natural ecological threats they might face, like a hurricane. And what you often find is that the social threats are much stronger predictors, not just of political preferences, but also just of, endorsing more rules, harsher punishments for criminals, all these elements of cultural tightness. But when you look at what people are actually experiencing, regions with historical occurrences of conflict like wars, and regions with historical occurrences of famines or natural disasters, these are equally strong predictors of cultural tightness when people are actually experiencing these things. And so it suggests that perceiving and experiencing threat actually has slightly different effects. And so I see kind of, when I think about the implications of this research, I think about different implications potentially for societies and for people. For societies, the story is kind of dark because according to almost any estimate, climate change will only get worse in the future. Temperatures and sea levels will continue to rise. And our research suggests that these environmental threats may actually be fueling the rise of governments that actively ignore them and that draft anti-climate change policies. And by that I mean policies that ignore the effects of climate change and make no effort to curb them. But for individuals, the story might be a little less morbid, because I think now more than ever we have the resources that we need to educate ourselves about candidates and about our environment, and we can deduce which threats are real and which might be imagined or blown up to an unreasonable degree by the media, and find the best ways of dealing with them. And so I would suggest that maybe as our next election approaches, anyone listening to this podcast put aside their assumptions and intuitions about what are urgent threats facing their country and read about what different candidates are actually advocating for and what actually might lead to the greatest loss of life or loss of wealth. Our research shows that our gut instincts about politics are frequently wrong, and that goes beyond what our paper shows. But maybe knowing about these instincts is the first sign for making an effective political choice.
Josh, you're Canadian, right?
I'm actually a New Zealander, like Julia. I just don't have the accent.
Oh, I didn't know that. I only assumed you were Canadian because the guy that founded Useful Science, Jan, is Canadian, and so quite a lot of the early contributors are Canadian.
Jan and I actually were in the same first-year dorm at McGill, and so I went to school in Canada.
Yeah. But is it just the nature of American politics to suck all the oxygen out of the room that we've got two New Zealanders on the show and we're so completely focused on American politics? Or is it more targeting our audience, do you think?
Well, from an international standpoint, I guess I'll say two things, and then maybe Julia can weigh in and say that I'm wrong. I think, first of all, everyone cares about American politics because it matters so much. America just has so much power that you want them to make the right decisions. And then the other reason maybe is because it's kind of a reality show. It's very interesting, and it sucks up so much media attention, which was what you're saying, and so we can't just help but be morbidly fascinated by everything that's happening in the States. I don't know. What do you think, Julia?
No, I'd second that. It's just the scale and the power and authority that the US can carry that can tip the scales in so many ways when we're thinking about politics globally, that people would be foolish not to pay attention to what was happening in the US, It also probably is the nature of the research that we're covering today. So Josh is obviously based in the US at the moment, and then the authors of the paper that I'm covering as well are also based in the US. And people have a bias towards what's familiar. So that could feed into it. If you want me to talk about New Zealand politics, I'm happy to do that too.
It's not as pessimistic as a story right now.
Oh, really?
Well, we've got an election in 2020 as well. And the date's been announced and the campaign's already started. So it's coming.
Yeah, it seems like right-wing politics are on the rise everywhere. Is that the case in New Zealand too?
No, currently we are one of the few countries that has a Labour or a left-leaning government at the moment, but there's no guarantee that in September, when we have our re-election, that the current Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern will be re-elected.
Could we look at the fallout of these Australia fires?
Oh, that's a change of tack.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up.
Well, I just wonder, would we predict, a rise of right-wing sentiments as a response to this?
Well, the current Australia PM, he's not really, I wouldn't call him a right-wing populist in any sense of the word. He's more a traditional conservative, Scott Morrison. And I guess it's kind of a case in point as to looking at broader dynamics versus individual cases, because with Scott Morrison, he's actually, I think his approval has suffered a lot because of these fires, but not necessarily because of his politics, but more because of his personal responses to them. Going on vacation and discussing how much the Australian economy should take precedent over the lives of the people who are being threatened by these fires. And only recently has he really changed his tone. But it would be interesting to look at the more Australia populist parties and how they fare in future elections. I think there's do you know the Australia Populist Party?
Pauline Hanson and One Nation.
Yeah, One Nation, that's it.
And yeah, they took a bit of a hit in the last election, but Pauline Hanson has been around for decades, and she is a chameleon who just keeps resurfacing. So given what Josh has discussed around these ecological or environmental threats and the impacts it has on voting patterns, you could hypothesize that Pauline Hanson and One Nation could be back in the game in their next election.
Yeah, we're actually doing, this is coming back to American politics, but we're doing this type of study right now to follow up on the paper I just discussed, where we're looking at congressional districts in the US, and we're looking over the last 50 years. There are really good records of storms, floods, tornadoes that have hit these areas of the country, and trying to predict left to right swings in the US over time on the basis of these events. And so, it's a very clear prediction that if the storm occurs, the week before an election, you might see an increase in turnout and voting for right-wing leaders. But we haven't really tested this over time, and so we're trying that now.
Okay, totally off-topic question. Why would one New Zealander have an accent and not another? Is it a regional thing? Is it just a factor of being in North America for longer?
One New Zealander moved to Denmark when he was 8 and lived there for a long time, and lost his accent over time. Yeah,
that makes sense.
And went back to New Zealand after uni, but didn't live there long enough to get it back.
Apparently, around the age of 8 is when accents really set in as well. So if you moved at that age, you were, chances of retaining a New Zealand accent were slim to none, which is possibly a blessing. Who knows, depending on perspective.
Well, it's funny because I'll speak to research assistants, we'll be in lab meetings and I'll say, well, I'm originally from New Zealand, and they'll kind of confront me like they're catching me on a lie. They'll be like, oh, you don't have an accent. And so it's funny how much accent's tied into identity. Perhaps if I was living in a right-wing populist New Zealand, I would be ostracized.
All kinds of hypotheses can be thrown out now, for sure.
Should we move on? All right, so Julia, let's jump to your article.
So with Josh's article, which was ecological and cultural factors underlying the global distribution of prejudice. He's trying to predict the variation in prejudice attitudes and political nationalism. Another key question is whether political polarization and the rise in political nationalism, whether the factors driving it are not only cultural but perhaps economic. If it's economics, then the appropriate remedy, which could be found, is in targeting economic injustice and inclusion. And so the advantage of asking the question of whether it's not just cultural factors but also economic factors that could be driving a rise in prejudice and an increase in political polarization is that if there are economic drivers in play, we might be able to figure out some social policy solutions to them. So today I'm reviewing a working paper that has been in circulation since 2016. It's by David Autor from MIT, David Dorn from the University of Zurich, Gordon Hansen from UC San Diego and the National Bureau of Economic Research, and Kavem Majlisi, apologies if I've mispronounced the name, from Lund, and the Institute of Labour Economics.
What does it mean that it's a working paper?
So this means it hasn't entered into a journal yet, so it hasn't been formally published. In economics, if researchers are aiming for one of the top journals, they often put the research out earlier and then revise it successively before it actually gets published. So this has been in circulation and been revised over the last, 4 years now.
It's like pre
peer review. Yeah, it's very much about a long game. And this paper shows that votes for Trump in the 2016 presidential election across US communities were strongly correlated, so not a causative relationship, just an association, but strongly correlated with the magnitude of adverse China trade shock. So what this meant is that everything else being equal, the greater the loss of jobs due to rising imports from China, the higher the support for Trump. And so they were the authors in this paper specifically wanted to find out and explore whether rising import competition contributes to the polarization of US politics.
I'm surprised that you can connect the loss of a job to a cause like that so cleanly.
Well, they say there could be they're not saying there are not other factors that are also contributing to this. They're just trying to determine, similar to what Josh was talking about, whether or not this could be one factor that's contributing to people's voting behaviour and political polarisation.
And it sounds like from what you're saying that they're looking over some period of time.
Yeah.
And so what's the window that we're talking about here?
So they're just looking from 2000 to 2016.
Okay.
But their motivation for asking the question stems from the fact that the ideological divide in American politics, which has been widening since the 1970s, is now at a historic high. So there's been a sizable rightward shift among the GOP, so the Republican Party, and a modest leftward shift among the Democrats, and people are moving from the centre. And there's also been, since the 70s, an increase in polarisation in terms of policy preferences. Through the 1990s and 2000s, 50% of people had pretty centrist policies, preferences, whereas by the late 2000s, this had dropped to 40%. So people were suddenly looking for more extreme positions to support. And the final thing that they were linking to is the fact that there's also been a greater polarisation in media viewing habits. So again, this is focused on the US, but after decades of non-partisan news programming, when Fox News launched in '96, they came in with a decidedly pro-conservative slant. And then by 2001, they were the top cable news channel. So this was a really dramatic shift from decades prior when news had been a very non-partisan media source.
And so what's the left-wing equivalent then in their analysis?
What do you mean exactly?
So people often talk about MSNBC as being the sort of like the counterpart to Fox, and maybe CNN as being more moderate, but do they see it like that?
They don't go into exploring specifically what would be the counterfactual on the left.
Okay.
But they're just saying that in 1996, Fox News entered the scene and were proudly presenting a pro-conservative slant which hadn't been seen in the media previously. And so one of the things that they say is the linkages between economic shocks and sustained increases in partisanship remain poorly understood. So what they're trying to do in this paper is break down and understand whether or not economic factors are contributing to the polarization of US politics. And so they use three major sets of data in this paper. They use survey data from the Pew Research Center, which is often used as a source of data in social sciences studies. They also use ratings data from Nielsen Media to examine the news viewing habits of households over time. And they also use a database on ideology, money in politics and elections to examine the ideological leanings of campaign donors. And they want to use these three different data sources to document the effect of exposure to rising manufacturing imports from China on political expression. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And what they find is that particularly between 2004 and 2016, the regions that were more exposed to import competition from China but became more likely to see three key things. What they found is that the analysis indicates that exposure to import shocks moves political sentiment away from the ideological centre in terms of political beliefs, in terms of media consumption, and in terms of the level of campaign donations. The support for positions on the right of the political spectrum increased. The shift of consumption of TV news to the right-leaning Fox also increased. And to extract campaign contributions from there was an increase in campaign contributions from both left-wing and right-wing donors, but no longer from moderates.
And so this is looking at regions and also looking over time. Are they finding like a lagged effect? Like if, you have a lot of trade in China in 2003, it's going to increase partisan donors in 2004, or is it done differently?
Well, one of the things they wanted to examine was how the trade shocks directly affected election outcomes. So they were interested in regional differences, and the districts that were exposed to larger increases in import competition became more likely to elect a GOP legislator in each election between 2010 and 2016. And they were then asking why this might be happening. So why could there be alternative explanations? And to answer that question, they further disaggregate their data, and the authors break down voting districts by their racial and ethnic compositions. And what they find is that rising trade exposure raises the odds that majority white, non-Hispanic areas elect GOP conservatives, and that majority non-white areas elect Democrats.
So it's driving polarization. It's not driving right-wing politics.
No, so it is driving polarization, but it's also, this is translating into an increase in right-wing politics in the US.
So they define right-wing politics as Republican but not moderate Republican?
That's right.
I see. And so is it that kind of, is there explanation that you have a right-wing a more extreme right-wing or left-wing politician who's elected, and then the other side compensates by being more extreme, and then this kind of creates a cycle? Or how exactly does trade translate to polarization?
So what they're saying is that in situations where there has been increased trade with China, the run-on effects in terms of inequality have driven people to become more, sort of similar to your cultural tightness hypothesis, Josh. People are more inclined to become insular and vote for what they know, not necessarily vote for what they know, but can lead to sharp ideological realignments.
That's really interesting, the role of income inequality, because of course it's in the interest of people at the top to vote for people who are going to advocate for really right-wing economic positions, and that people in the interest of people who are poor to advocate to vote for people who are advocating for more left-wing economic positions. And so that's the mechanism here, I guess.
Well, they don't go into a lot about inequality specifically, but other studies have suggested that one trigger for an increase in political polarization is this rise in inequality. This paper doesn't specifically address that.
Okay.
Even though we were talking about previously how these are very US-centric articles, other empirical studies have produced similar results for other countries. For instance, Western Europe, what you were talking about before with Le Pen, you're seeing similar trends through there. Higher penetration of Chinese imports has been found to be implicated in support for Brexit in Britain. So areas which were struggling as a result of changing manufacturing processes and stuff in the UK have tended to vote in favour of Brexit. And the rise of far-right nationalist parties in continental Europe has also occurred. Even in Sweden, increased labour market insecurity has been linked to the rise of the far-right Sweden Democrats. So it is happening. You're seeing these trends around the world.
Far-right Sweden Democrat. Is that the name of the party? I'm confused.
Sweden Democrats. I actually might have to check that. It's really strange because a lot of places, in a lot of countries, names that we associate with more progressive positions are actually more conservative, like Liberals in Australia. So
really?
Conservative
I didn't
party.
know that.
Yeah. So Labour is the more progressive party.
Okay.
Yeah, Sweden Democrats are the far-right party in Sweden.
Interesting. You see, as an American, I get to be ignorant of all these things.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess, I mean, these words are all so amorphous. They don't really mean much anymore. And so, like Democrats are just the system of voting. And so you can make it into whatever you want.
Yeah, it's like a historical accent, I suppose. The names of the parties and where they end up on the political spectrum.
Julia, you were saying before that if you can identify these economic causes, then you can potentially come up with solutions for processes like polarization. Does this, and I know that Trump has been raising tariffs on Chinese trade more and more throughout his presidency. What is the forecast of this on voting dynamics?
Whoa. Whoa, I'm not sure if I can speak directly to that, but I think I think you'll need to get a political economy expert.
Okay.
But I think one of the things that is important to remember, and this is something that's come through in this podcast, is that these are just one factor in a whole suite of complex factors that could be contributing to voting behaviour. People try to tease apart different elements so we can paint a fuller picture of society and the choices that people are making. But one of the reasons, for instance, in this paper, they talk about correlation rather than causation is they're saying, all right, we're seeing an association. We're seeing that there's a relationship between these factors, but we're not saying this is A is causing B.
It's tricky because with these papers my paper included, that are dealing with such huge issues. I mean, you can give simple, useful messages like, don't trust your gut about how under threat your community might be, but it's difficult to really advocate for broad solutions because you just realize how many economic and social and environmental factors are combining to lead to these big political dynamics.
Well, I think as well, historical trends, you can take certain messages out of historical trends, but we're really entering a new age with the way that we get and absorb media and that sort of thing. And so that adds another complexity in terms of trying to predict the future.
The listeners currently know more than we do about the outcome of this Democratic primary process. It might be that Iowa's in the process of nominating Biden or something. We're working towards a more moderate party. I don't know. Who knows? Or we might come at it tonight with Bernie. We'll see.
Is the thing happening today?
Well, it's a whole process. It's each state has their own primary, and they're spread over, I don't know, a month or two? I don't know. I've been pretty disconnected intentionally from politics the last 6 months or so for my own mental health.
It's spread over a few months, so they actually end in June, and so...
But does Iowa kick off today?
Iowa kicks off today, yes. And so It's going to be another 3-4 months of this, just waiting.
And then it'll be, another thing, and then it'll be another thing, and it'll be another thing.
And then the general election begins. And then people wonder why everyone focuses on American politics. It's like any given day, we're either about to have an election or one is ongoing.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary.
It's all consuming, like news is politics, it seems like these days.
But then you see the general trends and the levels of trust in the news and the trust in the media. And news might be politics, but at the same time, how much people are absorbing and what they're choosing to translate into their belief systems is really questionable.
Yeah, the amount of the erosion of traditional media and the sort of the spread of small media outlets has allowed us to really fine-tune the kind of news that we get so that it completely conforms with our political opinions. I
saw a Vox article not long ago, and the title was Flood the Media with Shit. Steve Bannon's, that's his strategy.
Whose strategy?
Steve Bannon's.
Oh, yeah.
His position was in the last election, the Democrats don't matter. What we have to do is completely destroy people's trust so nobody knows where to turn or what to do. I found the article quite insightful, not because it delivered anything new, but it was just a concise analysis of the approach that had been taken by various strongmen who are currently in office in order to just completely disrupt democratic process.
And why does Steve Bannon even matter anymore? Isn't he out at Breitbart? Isn't he?
Yeah, he's still giving interviews and speaking, but he doesn't really have any power anymore. There's one paper I wanted to find on... your paper reminded me of it, Julia. It was a great paper on the rise of Fox News, and they'd done some big geographic analysis. Maybe it's not destined to be in this episode, though. I think it was Bias in Cable News, Persuasion and Polarization. It was tracking, I think, it was tracking how news exposure, just by virtue of the position of cable channels, actually influenced political preferences. Because just because of where cable stations are and how TV networks are set up, in some counties, for example, Fox might be higher on it might be a lower number, and so it might be on as you're flicking through the channels earlier.
Oh, right, that's interesting.
And they found that in these areas, people were more often voting Republican, just because they just would land on Fox more, and then they would have their political attitudes changed.
Wow. Interesting.
And so it shows you how influential these cable companies are.
It's like when you name your plumbing company AAA Plumbing, so you show up first in the phone book.
Yeah, right. It's brilliant, and it was a nice kind of opportunity for a natural experiment, historical experiment. Anyway, I don't know. I feel like we're kind of wrapping up on this episode anyway.
Let's do.
I just thought of that when you were talking about Fox and media and how it doesn't, it's all bullshit.
I know it's almost an accident of like my interest in science like really stems from like a couple of podcasts I kind of stumbled into when I was young, specifically the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which I kind of found when I was like, I don't know, maybe like a freshman in college or something, and it had this really profound effect on the way that I look at the world. That kind of grew from there and then extended to other interests. But like, if I had stumbled across something else instead, like, I don't know, the Joe Rogan podcast or something, like, I don't know what kind of a different person I would be today. Well, that's our show. We always appreciate listener feedback. You can email us at podcast@usefulscience.org. You can also find us on Twitter @usefulsci. That's SCI, Useful Sci. We have a subreddit where you can talk about this episodes and other things that we post on the website @/r/usefulscience. And you can find us on Facebook. Just search for Useful Science. I want to thank our great editor from the Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee. I want to thank the composer for our intro music, Solomon Krauss and La. My name is Cameron Spencer. You can follow me on Twitter @usonic. That's EUSONIC.
My name is Joshua Conrad Jackson. You can follow me on Twitter @Josh_C_Jackson.
My name's Julia Torbett Jones, and I'm not on Twitter, so you can't follow me there.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.